Our next presenter is Maureen Bader, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Maureen is a native of Vancouver, British Columbia. She comes to the CTF from the Public Affairs Bureau with the British Columbia Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources. Before that, she was a manager of corporate communications and public affairs at the Prince Rupert Port. She completed her undergraduate degree in psychology at the Universidad Internacional de Mexico in Mexico City and her MBA from Simon Fraser University here. She has worked in agriculture, banking, transportation, and energy industries in capacities ranging from market analysis to communication. She was active on the boards of directors of the Simon Fraser Alumni Association and the Canadian Council for the Americas. Maureen worked at the Fraser Institute in 1991 and has published a number of articles, including a paper on the benefits of a free banking system in South Africa. Maureen is going to present another sticking point, the role of the private sector.
Speech. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is a non-profit, nonpartisan organization whose goals are to work towards lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is affordable housing and the role of the private sector. So, as we all know, housing in Vancouver is really expensive and becoming increasingly unaffordable for everyone. I don't know how many of you lived here through the 90s, but believe me, no one was worrying about housing affordability at that time, especially not in 1998. We were moving into have-not status. People were leaving the province. What's happening now? The economy is booming, industries are coming back, and so are the people. As a result, the demand for housing has gone way up. The supply of housing, on the other hand, while increasing, isn't increasing as fast as it should. Well, why not? And that's the focus of my presentation. But before I do that, I just want to review quickly this noble idea about government provision of housing, which is some people's solution to the problem, but why it doesn't really seem to work very well. What happens when the public sector builds housing? Well, the history of government provision of public housing is littered with examples of buildings deteriorating before their time. A very good example of that was a housing project in St. Louis, Missouri, built in 1956, and unfortunately, for both people who needed housing and the taxpayers, the entire thing had to be demolished 16 years after it was built. Now, the primary reason why government-built social housing is inefficiently constructed and maintained relative to private sector housing is because social housing managers face very different incentives from private sector managers. If a private landlord builds a poor quality of apartment building or fails to maintain that, tenants will just leave. And that's going to hurt the landlord in the place that bothers him the most, which of course is in his wallet. On the other hand, the managers of social housing projects face very different incentives because no one really owns the project, and so no one is going to benefit financially from an efficient operation. Suppose the management of a particular housing project did such a great job, the demand to live in the project tripled relative to other subsidized units. In the private market, such an effort would be rewarded by higher rents and increased profits. But in the public arena, there are no higher rents because of subsidization, and so no profit. The result is that there is little incentive to maintain or improve social housing. And if you don't think that doesn't happen here, go and take a look at some of the Greater Vancouver Housing Corporation managed buildings in Surrey. Today, most housing is built by the private sector. The private sector is motivated by profit, for sure. There's money to be made in housing. Why is it then that the supply of housing hasn't kept up with demand when we have all these private individuals out there who'd be more than willing to build housing? So in other words, why isn't there more supply coming into the market? And as we've already discussed, it's because the costs are really high, but why are costs so high here? We all know that Vancouver is the 13th least affordable city in the world, and average housing costs run 7.7 times average incomes. Well, as we heard already, land costs are high, and why is that? Well, it's because land use restrictions are the #1 reason why housing is so unaffordable in Vancouver. We have an artificial land shortage, which is created by restricting the development of lands on the urban fringe, combined with layers of red tape, driving up costs of housing. Vancouver likely has the nation's strictest zoning rules. Unsurprisingly, we also have the country's least affordable housing market. 30 years ago, a large amount of land in the province was set aside for agriculture. In typical government fashion, we now have a great deal of land tied up for agriculture, which is neither suitable for agriculture or hasn't been used for agriculture in decades. About 70% of Metro Vancouver is fenced off for development as part of this green zone, and 20% of Metro Vancouver is included in the agricultural land reserve. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we don't want to have parks and we don't want to have land set aside for agriculture. But we want affordable housing too. Maybe it's time to look at that balance. Now, the other thing that was alluded to earlier is unreasonable building standards. Density restrictions and this parking slot requirement, those are just two examples. But another one that I'm sure will get some comments is this move towards green building standards. This is going to significantly increase the cost of housing, once again, making it less affordable. Let's face it, the cost of housing is pushed up when new homes are required to install expensive energy-saving materials. That jacks up the cost of appliances, lighting requirements with lighting that require compliance with Energy Star standards. That jacks up the cost of energy by subsidizing inefficient forms of energy such as wind power, and at the same time making conventional fossil fuels more expensive. The Ministry of Energy and Mines. Okay. If governments made all of these so-called green initiatives revenue neutral, those initiatives wouldn't necessarily have to drive up the cost of housing. So there are solutions for this, and there's always a balance and trade-off. Builders pay fees to the municipality. These fees drive up the cost. So you think, I'm paying this fee, I'm going to get a service. But many of these services, formerly provided by ministries, such as inspection services, are now provided by the private sector. So builders are paying for services they're not receiving. City planners take all of these green things, and they think about, this would be really nice to have a nice green place with lots of parks and all of these really energy efficient buildings. But that drives up the cost. They don't think about how much these things are going to cost when they start thinking about how nice all these extra things will be. So it's tough to build affordable housing when the government makes building a house so expensive by restricting land use and imposing high development fees and building standards. But even before this recent huge increase in the cost of housing, low-income people would be more likely to rent than to buy. Well, I just moved back to Vancouver in April, and I couldn't believe how expensive it was to try to rent a place. Not only expensive, but try to find a place to rent. Now, why is that? Well, in part it's because hardly anybody builds rental units anymore. Well, why is that? The federal government no longer provides tax incentives for rental construction. And with such high building costs, private investors just can't make money building rental units. Prior to 1971, 50% of all new housing in this area was built for rental use. Now, with lower taxes could encourage more rental construction. So, when you're working in your groups later, don't think, how can we force people to build more affordable housing? Think, what's standing in the way of building affordable housing now? And also, what can we do to encourage people to build rental units? Reducing construction costs through lower taxes, the reduction or elimination of fees, opening up more land for housing, and getting rid of unreasonably high building standards would go a long way to help achieve housing affordability.